Hello, bonjour. Welcome to the next episode of Stuck at Home. Today we're going to talk about, as usual, Chez Couture, what I'm wearing and where it came from and who it was made by and why you should never throw your beautiful old clothes away. You should either pass them on or recycle them in some way. And I'm also going to do a reading or another story from my book, Eat Your Heart Out, of Unusual Love Stories. And this one is set in Provence, in the south of France, in the 12th century. It is extremely gruesome. I hope you've already had your dinner. Right, now, this is all pleats please, Izimiaki. And it's, as usual, got all this complicated folding and fabulosity going on and tied with strings at the side. And underneath is sort of a shift dress. And underneath that is some pleats please pants. The earrings are Indian. And they are, once again, it's an elaborate combination of stones and bits and pieces that have been sewn and stuck onto leather on the back. I bought those in Calcutta years ago. Also the shoes, which I've had probably since, I don't know, the 1990s maybe, are Kate Spade sandals. Fabulous American designer who's sadly now gone to heaven. So, this is the story of Céramonde and Guillaume, who were in love in the 12th century. Now, the story is set in Provence, in the village of Roussillon. And you will find out as the story goes on why Roussillon is named after the color rouge, red. And Roussillon to this day still has red soil. But it's not only because it's red soil, naturally, it's because in the 12th century, a common problem-solving device for ladies who were in trouble was to throw themselves off the ramparts of their castles, thus staining the ground below with their red blood. And to this day, Roussillon in the south of France still has red soil. So we're in Provence, and in that era, in the 12th century, Provence was under the control of the Catalan counts of Barcelona. It was run by the Spanish. Céramonde, isn't that the most beautiful name? Our heroine lived in, in all these stories that are extremely old, there are many versions. So some versions say that she lived in Roussillon, some versions say that she was in the village of Beau. She lived in the castle. Her husband was Count Ramon. Now, also, all marriages were arranged in those days, especially amongst the upper classes. I mean, she would have been married off to this guy. I think the marriage was arranged when she was 7, and she married him when she was 14. He was quite a bit older than her. And so they didn't marry for love, but they married for connections, for tribal connections, and to forge agreements between different parties. So, but normally there were many rules around arranged marriages in the upper class. And normally they worked okay if everybody obeyed the rules and stuck to what was expected of them. Nobody expected you to be in love with anybody. Into the story comes a handsome troubadour. Now, troubadours, we often think that troubadours were wandering minstrels who were poor and who just went from castle to castle entertaining people and writing poems and stuff. But in fact, when I was researching the story in this book, it turned out that the troubadours were very high class, and they weren't necessarily wandering around at all. They would quite often just work within one castle, and they quite often came from very high up families they were very well educated, and they wrote very elaborate poetry and lyrics and songs of exceptional beauty and refinement. And they wrote them for normally, well, they would write them to tell stories of what was going on, but they also wrote a lot of love poems to the ladies in the court, because the ladies in the court had nothing to do. And they were platonic love poems. They weren't poems, romantic ones or sexual ones. And you weren't supposed to fall in love with these ladies if you were a troubadour. But in this instance, in this story, the troubadour, whose name was Guillaume, and the lady of the house, Saramonda, fell in love. This was the worst thing they could have done. So, eventually, they were carrying on and meeting each other secretly and feeding each other pomegranate seeds. And he was writing these love poems to her, and she was just like, he was nothing like her husband. He was handsome, and he had long hair, tied up in ribbons. And he was just absolutely gorgeous. And of course, she was a great beauty, because everybody is in these mythological tales. The husband, Ramon, finds out what's going on. And this is where the story diverges. Either, there are two versions, or more than two versions actually. Either he conscripts Guillaume to go to war in some place that they were warring in and put him in the front line knowing that he would be killed. And in this story, he is badly wounded, and as he's dying, the troubadour says to his vassal, "Here, take a lock of my hair and take it back to Saramonda, and when I've died, cut my heart out and take my heart with you and give it to her as a token of my eternal love." And so the vassal got on his horse, having got the heart and the lock of hair, was riding towards the castle, and he was intercepted by the count's men, and he was killed, of course. And the count's men took the heart and gave it to the count and said, "Look what we've got." The other version of the story is that the count killed him himself. He asked him to go out hunting with him in the forest, and he killed him and cut his heart out himself and took it back. Anyway, the heart arrives in the castle. Saramonda knows nothing of all this. The count gives the heart to his cook in the kitchen and says, "Could you cook this up for me? This is a fabulous ox heart that we got when we were out hunting." So the cook does that. You know what's going to happen, right? Are you ready? So he invites his wife to a private dinner at the top of the castle where the ramparts are, all very elaborately laid out. And he presents her with this beautiful ox heart meal. And she starts eating it. And he says to her, "Darling, are you enjoying that?" And she says, "Yes, sir. I am really enjoying it. You know I love offal. I particularly like ox heart." And he says, "Well, bitch, that's your lover's heart. Enjoy it." She goes completely white, and she says, "I don't believe you. I don't believe you would do such a thing." And he says, "Really? Don't you? Okay." Calls in the servant. Servant brings out a platter, covered platter, takes the lid off, and there is the beautiful troubadour's head. She stands up, and in her most regal way she says, "In that case, good sir, this is the most noble meal I have ever eaten, and I need never eat again." So saying, she ran to the ramparts and threw herself off. And that is why Roussillon, the soil of Roussillon, is still red to this day. When the King of Spain, when the Prince of Aragon, who were the Spanish princes ruling the south of France found out what he had done, he was absolutely furious because she was very well loved in the area, and her lover, the troubadour, came from a very high up family, and so things had to be done. He had to show that he was not going to put up with this kind of stuff. So he had the Count Ramon, the husband, hunted down and killed, and anybody who'd helped him was killed as well. All his property and his money were given to the family of the troubadour and the family of Saramonda. But the story doesn't entirely end there, because there was a huge funeral organized by the Spanish from Aragon for this couple, or what was left of them, in a very dramatic, gigantic funeral that everybody from far and wide came to in the Cathedral of Perpignan. And for hundreds of years after that, their grave became a pilgrimage site for lovers who were star-crossed in their love stories. And the moral of the story, of course, is you are what you eat. Merci. Au revoir. À la prochaine.